You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
On last week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, we started a conversation with Paul Angel, Executive Editor of TBR Magazine, talking about this huge 25th anniversary edition, September-October edition of TBR Magazine. We came nowhere near close to finishing that conversation within the hour last week. So we're bringing Paul back again this week, and we will finish the conversation as we go article by article through this just huge, great 25th anniversary edition of the Barnes Review.
Well, let's get back into the magazine here. On page 46, I believe it is, there's an article by John Weir on why Hitler invaded Norway and Denmark. You kind of alluded a little bit earlier why Hitler invaded Poland, but the invasions of Norway and Denmark are a lot less talked about.
Right. And, in Norway, of course, was extremely valuable strategically and also for their natural resources. But listen, Hitler didn't just waltz in there, although he did believe that being a Nordic country, they would accept him a little more than they did. But they're very fiercely independent people who would resist any invader. But there was the British who were trying to get in there and create bases and take over that country well before. And he did it basically as a preemptive strike. Denmark was a traditionally Teutonic nation, of course, right, and very strategically located. And he did it quite quickly. But more or less, it was to basically why Germany took control of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Soviet Union, and other countries. Why he did was to protect his own interests there and to prevent the British from taking over these countries that they could have then used to strangle Hitler. By the way, he when did he invade Norway? Was it 1939 as well?
I'd have to go back and look at that.
I believe it was.
Yes, sir. October 9th, 1939.
Right. So they had been trying. The British had been trying to put in naval and air bases, of course. And it was, kind of like what we're doing now with the Russians. I'm surprised the Russians have been so patient, but placing nuclear weapons on their borders, trying to make sure that we control the Crimea, right? That all the mess in the Crimea, making sure that we control what's going on in the former Soviet republics, and basically extremely provocative moves. But again, you're never going to get the truth about that in history books today because it doesn't follow their particular narrative. These phony historical and political narratives have been going on, as you well know, for quite some time. You almost have to wonder what truth have we been given about anything if truth has come, if books are consistently written by the victors of the wars. But German naval intelligence in February of 1940 had broken the British naval codes. And so they knew what the Allies' plans and activities were going to be. And they had found out that the Allies were preparing for operations against Norway, but under the pretext of helping Finland against the Soviet Union, I think. So basically, the British intentions were quite clear. And they also knew that the only way they were going to really beat the Germans was, for Britain and France specifically, that if they could crush that their ability to acquire iron ore. So, because that's so important to everything. This is why they not only they were building up military operations in Scandinavia for quite some time. Weir's an interesting guy. He's extremely even-handed, I always say. Dozens of footnotes in these, which I like to know what sources he's using. So in the end, he took over those countries, and hopefully it was going to do it a little more peacefully. But he took them over to protect his own self-interest. The one big name that comes out of that, of course, is Quisling, right? If the Germans had won the war, Quisling would be our synonym for hero, right? Not for traitor. But the story of Quisling along in there is an interesting side story to the story of Norway. And of course, listen, one of the things that Hitler was most worried about was the creation of these air bases in Norway, because they would have given them a great way to attack Germany, in which they would have, because we now know, reading the story that's coming up after that, when the article about Hitler, about how Churchill perpetrated and perpetuated the Second World War, you'll see exactly what Churchill's true intentions were towards Germany, which was simply to wipe it off the face of the map. England did not want any competition anywhere, and he knew that as many peace offers as he made to Churchill rejected them all. So he knew also what Churchill, the warmongering drunkard, I mean, how this guy got this great reputation, I have no idea. But he knew what his true intentions were.
Well, did you write the caption under Churchill's picture that he may have been the most evil man on the earth?
That was Sean Tiffany. Yes.
Okay.
He went a little overboard there. But he was, I mean, do you look what Churchill was responsible for? And, of course, John mentions in this the 4 million men, women, and children starved to death in Bengal, right, during his colonial policies. But they buy into this, that he was the greatest Briton of all time. John says here, in his youth, serving in Afghanistan, Churchill said, all who resist will be killed without quarter, and boasted of his atrocities, such as burning villages. We filled up the wells, cut down the great shady trees, burned the crops, and broke the reservoirs. And in Greece, he had his army perpetrate massacres in the streets of Athens in 44. 28 protesters were gunned down, 128 were injured. He didn't care. And then, according to John, Churchill had more war crimes than Henry Kissinger. He had war crimes in India, Iran, Iraq, Ireland, Kenya, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and other places around the globe. Here's a perfect example of a fake reality in how victors can write the history. And you had John Weir to make this to make his point, quotes many British historians, and I think that was a good way to handle this, is to say how the honest British historians look back at Churchill. So, I mean, look at, there's also a book that we sell called What the World Rejected, and it was the number of peace offers that Hitler had offered Churchill, and how many times he just simply out of hand rejected them, and it could have saved millions and millions of lives. And everybody knows, right, that he sent Hess over there. It's funny when you Rudolf Hess to make peace, and when he crashed the plane, what they do then, when anybody talking to Hess, they locked him up for the remainder of his life, practically in solitary confinement. It rarely got out. Ended up killing him. And it was certainly not just him hanging himself. He was too old and too arthritic to have done what they claimed he did. But, at the time, if you look at the newspaper reports in England, the headlines, many of them would say, Hess crashed his plane. But a lot of them said, Hess turns back on Hitler, runs away to side with allies, which was completely false. And so they were even brainwashing the public at the time. And, of course, you had an article on the Volkswagen, right, in that particular issue. And if you think back, what a shame it is that the little Volkswagen, after all these years, has gone by the wayside.
You think about vehicles over the years. The Model T is an iconic vehicle, but how long did that body design last? Maybe 15, 20 years, and Ford moved on. You even think of there were Dodges that, say, from about 1965 to about 1985, all the body parts were interchangeable on all the Dodge vehicles because they pretty much had one body design regardless of what the vehicle was. But, that was only about a 25 year period as well. Those Volkswagens didn't change for 80 years. I mean, you talk about an iconic vehicle.
It's got to be the most recognizable body shape. But unfortunately, it just came off, its last one came off the assembly line. The reason we're interested in it, because Adolf Hitler was involved in its design. Now, many people deny that. We ran an article years ago proving that Hitler was quite integrally involved with Porsche.
Well, in Mein Kampf, even Hitler talks about a car, and he talks about the beetle, the bug, the beetle, and how it's perfectly aerodynamic design, and how he's talking about designing a vehicle, that would be aerodynamically perfect. It would be shaped like the aerodynamically perfect beetle.
Right. Absolutely. So that's a nice little commentary that you had submitted there. And of course, to move on with that issue, we cover as much as we can in those issues. Even at 140 pages, you can't cover everything in World War II. But we had very good interesting, again, by John Weir, in which, of course, we always talk about the Holocaust one way or another. And in this particular one, he's very interested in explaining why so many Soviets died in German captivity. So people need to read that article. We're not apologists for anyone. And so here it is. The question is, why did 3 million Soviet POWs die in the German under German care during World War II, when such a fraction of that number of POWs from Britain and in the United States specifically died? So he has a very interesting article explaining the numbers and why so many died. In the end, one of the great contributing factors was Stalin himself, who said that there were no such thing as a Soviet prisoner of war, that anybody there was, but they couldn't possibly be there, number one, in such great numbers, and they were traitors for the most part. And so every time that Hitler would try to do these prisoner exchanges, of course, Stalin would reject those, saying there's no such thing as a Soviet prisoner of war. So people should take a look at that, because that's a large number, 3 million, okay? And so you have to ask, was there a policy of extermination? Was there a final solution for the Soviet prisoners? Or did they die of disease and starvation because Germany simply couldn't handle so many prisoners?
Well, in the end, each country sort of treated prisoners from the other country the way the other country treated their prisoners. And since the American and the Germans who were held in captivity by the American, by the British, by the Canadians, and so forth were well treated, and so the Germans treated those prisoners well. The German prisoners who were held by the Soviets were barbarized, and so the Germans just started neglecting the Soviet prisoners. I mean, it was just a matter of reciprocation.
To some degrees. I don't think they sat around and just let them die. But there was very little they could do for so many of them, and most assuredly you are correct that they weren't going to bend over backwards considering how many of their own guys were being killed. You can't sit there and defend either side, but specifically you have to condemn more vociferously Stalin for his absolute unconcern for the 3 to 5, 6, 7 million, that's a lot of guys, Soviet prisoners of war, and almost a number that's almost you can't care for that number of guys. We also got a very good interview with through Bonnie Faulkner, who's from the Guns and Butter radio program, great gal, and she's been persecuted for having.
I was going to say, how does Bonnie get away with the things that she talks about being in Canada? Because I know that speech is a lot more restricted in Canada than it is here in the United States.
Well, she may be in the United States now. I'm not sure. I know that we send off checks for these things, and her address that she gave us was in the United States, could be forwarded on. I don't know how she has an AM radio station when she talks about this stuff. She's very careful, I guess, and make sure that she doesn't talk about it. But yeah, she lost her job on the flagship station because she talked about with Bacque and others about World War II matters. They're absolutely taboo. And most people know about James Bacque. He was the author of Crimes and Mercies, and the other one was Other Losses. Here, this particular interview was about other losses, and that was his investigation and the mass number of deaths of German prisoners at the hands of the French and Americans. Now, you talk about people treating you reciprocally. That's not necessarily 100% true, because the Germans took pretty good care of American prisoners, and during the war, perhaps we did as well, the German prisoners. But after the war, Eisenhower just rounded them up, put them in camps with no sanitation, no structures, no barracks, no exercise, the rations that wouldn't keep any of them alive, and they died in the droves. Millions of them died.
Well, he talks about how Eisenhower, it was kind of a sleight of hand. They weren't prisoners of war; they were disarmed enemy combatants.
Right.
Therefore, the Geneva Convention didn't apply.
Of course, and that itself is a war crime. But yeah, he totally rewrote the Geneva Convention so that he could just let these guys die. He hated Germans evidently and had a few quotes during his career that showed that Eisenhower was a German hater. And these guys didn't deserve this. A lot of them ended up becoming slave labor for the Soviets, but it almost might give you a better chance to survive in a gulag than it would have been to have lived in one of Eisenhower's death camps. If you see the pictures there, as you know, there wasn't any sanitation. They'd dig a hole. And, of course, that's mixing it with the fresh water, and dysentery was running wild. Starvation was running wild. It was getting cold out there. They had no proper clothing. They had no proper coverings against the elements. It's the way you'd kill 2 million people if that was your goal.
The picture on page 72 makes the Andersonville prison camp in Georgia look like a luxury resort.
Yeah. Andersonville, that's a different story, but that's correct. They were jammed in there pretty tight. And you imagine you wonder if the same thing might not have been going on in that way. But the treatment of the German prisoners, and it was in violation of every rule of war. It's why we have rules of war, because sometimes will devolve into barbaric, our barbaric state as a predator. And but you look at how they treated these guys, it was absolutely horrendous, and millions died. Of course, James Bacque also wrote Crimes and Mercies about and I did mention that later on when you talk about the Sudeten Germans being forced out of Czechoslovakia, but every German was forced out of every area that had been part of the Reich, or they had lost after World War II from the Versailles Treaty, and this was millions. But we focused upon one particular event in the head of the local militia was Karol Pazur, off there in a part of the Sudetenland, and they were taking a train of German refugees, and they pulled out of a station. Of course, at the time, they'd pull you off the train, and they'd ask if you were a former Nazi, and if they thought you were, and you said no, they'd hit you until you finally said yes. But anyway, they pulled men, women, children off this, and in Pazur and his men lined him up and shot him. I'm looking for the exact place, which is they were Sudeten Germans fleeing Czechoslovakia. They were going through the town. They were
in Moravia when the train was stopped.
That's right, Prerov. And they just lined him up and shot him. 71 men, 120 women, 74 children, one 8-month-old child. And this type of a war crime is never discussed in any type of book. Well, that's not true. It's just not going to get it published by a big publishing house. But that would be more related to Bach's second book, which was Crimes and Mercies. And, of course, that's a great interview. Now, Bach's always been one who's been even-handed himself. Although he'll expose the crimes of the Allies, he's no fan of the Germans, and is always – but still, he has seen his career ruined, his books taken out of publication, his inability – and here's a great writer and a great scholar – an inability to find publishers for any books that he's coming up with. Tried to do it himself, but we all know how hard it is, and the profit margins in publishing, especially books, is minimal now. And so he's nearly been ruined by writing these types of books. But at least he's honest enough to continue to push forward. And then you had also a commentary from Netherlands Railroad. I won't get into that. They should probably read that themselves. But it just brings the point that anybody who was involved at all and didn't stand up for the Germans and during World War II and at any part in, quote unquote, the Holocaust are being sued today, 70 years later or whatever it is. And they're criminals, they're racists, they're horrible, and, it was a wartime. One of the things that we all know is that Hitler was a monster, right? Hitler was an absolute monster, but I did have a story in here about Hitler's attempts to reunite French POW with their wives and families.
I'll say, personally, I thought this was probably the best article of the whole issue. I know that it's probably not as detailed or as powerful maybe as some of the others, especially the Verwolf article, but just from the human side of it, it showed a side of Germany that, given the bad publicity of 50 years, you would think was impossible. That's correct.
So the basic story is, after the French were quickly defeated in World War II, but 2 million French soldiers were captured in 6 weeks during the Battle of France. Now, 1.5 million of them were transferred to Germany. because Germany desperately needed labor. Understand this was 4% of the French population. So, as a matter of fact, Margaret Hustickler, who translated this for us from the work of Vincent Renoir, says this amounted to about 4% of the French population. 1 in every 7 Frenchmen between the ages of 20 and 40 was captured. Well, he could have killed them all, I guess, and gunned them down. But anyway, he took 1.5 million of them, Hitler did, to Germany, and they worked. But, he had a heart, believe it or not. And you would never believe it if you just read books from mainstream publishers. But he offered the chance for the wives and families to be reunited with them in Germany. Oh, well, he just probably wanted them slave labor, right? People would say, and to increase the ranks of Germans. No, he insisted that the wives go back to France to have the babies. And it was just a very generous gesture. 1, to allow the wives to be with their husbands, and 2, for family members to actually be reunited, and to be done on German soil. So that's a very good one. Of course, Renoir has been locked up a couple times and been on the run. And he has a book called The French Gestapo Trials that several of my readers have said is extremely important, because he goes back over the trials in France of the Gestapo, and he finds that they were much more even-handed in these trials than were at Nuremberg. So these poor same Nazis came up under charges at the Nuremberg trial that they'd already been exonerated from, for the most part, by the French. And believe me, the French had more reason than anybody to want to be vindictive and dole out punishment, but there simply wasn't the evidence in many aspects to prove that the Gestapo was the evil masterminds of genocide in France that they were alleged to have been. So that is, Renoir has done some great work and paid a price for it. And so, he was the one who uncovered this whole effort of the Germans to reunite French wives and families with prisoners. So I'm glad you enjoyed that one. I like upbeat stories too, but right after that is Tom Goodrich.
It's a bloody Tom Goodrich story. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Listen, Tom tells the truth. And it irritates him when people water stuff down. And so he writes for us to tell the truth. But basically, this was about the denazification program and how they were treated. It's funny. We found this poster that was hung up after the war, and they immediately started this mass guilt campaign. So I'll read a bit from this. This poster of pictures of bodies and piled up and everything else from starvation. It was a concentration camp victims and typhus. And even the Allies couldn't stop it when they got there. So how they expected the Germans to do it, I don't know, especially at, say, a place like Dachau. But it says, these atrocities are your fault. In 12 years, the Nazi criminals have tortured and murdered millions of Europeans. Men, women, and children were hunted and tortured to death by Hitler's brutish henchmen simply because they were Jews, Czechs, Russians, Poles, or French. You quietly watched and tolerated it. Battle-hardened soldiers of the Allies could not hide their disgust and outrage in the face of the gassed, charred, and emaciated bodies of the victims in the concentration camps. Blah, blah, blah. It's interesting, though, they say in Buchenwald camp, according to German camp reports, 50,000 people were burned, shot, and hanged. Only 50,000. I thought it was more like 2 or 3 million. But anyway, they found 50 wagons in Dachau. 10,000 people there succumbed to their tortures. As we know, Dachau, the vast majority of the deaths there were from typhus, as it was verified by Allied troops and doctors who came in afterward. In Belsen, British troops found torture chambers. I don't know of any torture chambers I've ever seen. But anyway, incinerators, gallows, and whipping posts. Yes, there were gallows and there were whipping posts. The gallows were used on hundreds of occasions to hang prisoners there of all ethnicities and religions for breaking camp regulations, trying to escape, abusing other fellow prisoners, many. And they alleged 30,000 died there. That's interesting, just 30,000 according to, and that's an inflated number there, but of course that number has grown drastically. At any rate, you've watched idly by, the poster tells the German citizen. Why did you not rouse the German conscience with any word of protest, with any cry of outrage? Well, we know that some Germans did resist Hitler, but anyway, this is your great guilt. You were jointly responsible for these gruesome crimes. So we see there the brainwashing of the German nation beginning immediately, and the exaggeration of war crimes happening and immediately started. And we know today, right, the guilt that they're trying to work the same program on us. Oh, you had slaves and you tried to convert the American Indians to Catholicism. How dare you? And you freed your slaves. How dare you? You allowed them to be educated and read and broke the rules, Robert E. Lee. Bring that statue right down there, man. So we see it happening today. That particular program is in, as I said, the parallels between Germany and, pre-Hitler Germany and post-Tsar Russia are striking. And, of course, we see the same thing happening here in the United States with this guilt program. I'm surprised we'll probably have had, posters up on the streets we're going to have to see with pictures of us up there, right, going, do not be like these war criminals, right, who dared to speak their minds. So don't underestimate what could happen. And, of course, we have an article again by Goodrich on the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. Now, we've covered this before, again, in previous issues years ago, and it was more of a blow-by-blow account. But with Goodrich, you're going to get the quotes from the people, which is what I really like about Tom. Tom may be talking about some horrible stuff, but he's not doing the talking. He's letting the witnesses do the talking. He's letting the victims do the talking. He's even letting sometimes the perpetrators do the talking. So in his article on the Wilhelm Gustloff, for those who don't know, there were so many Germans and Holocaust victims who decided to go with the Germans rather than stay behind, who were fleeing the Russians from as they advanced through raping and pillaging everything in sight through Eastern Europe, that they had to get across the Baltic. And so the Germany had converted multiple passenger liners, and I mean massive passenger liners. These passenger liners might have been, some of them, the Wilhelm Gustloff, might have been designed to carry 6,000. But they were so desperate to get out of there, they'd jam on everybody they could. So they had like 9,000 to 12,000. Some people say as many as 12. Almost impossible to believe. And some say it was about 9,500. And there was other ones too, of course. You remember, I'm trying to think of some of the other names of the other ones. It was Operation Hannibal was the name of the operation. And, of course, the passenger liners were basically converted into hospital ships. And on those hospital ships, you might have an office or two for like 9 or 12 Waffen-SS guys. Maybe you might have 50 guys on there. And so, of course, they allege that sinking these passenger liners loaded to the gills with innocent civilians, many of them children, many of them women and elderly people, was not a war crime. Well, as these passenger liners got into the Baltic, the Russians showed up and torpedoed them. They didn't give a hoot. And they went into the icy Baltic, and thousands died. You think the Titanic was something. The Titanic was nothing compared to the deaths of tens of thousands, because, again, it wasn't just the Wilhelm Gustloff. It was a few other passenger liners that the name off the top of my head escapes me. But we did do another article on January 14, January, February 2014 edition, in which we go into this. But they just brutally torpedoed these things. I mean, what were these people doing? It wasn't really a military target. Oh, yeah, it had that little office with a couple Waffen-SS guys in there. So you had 50 Waffen-SS guys and 12,000 fleeing or 11,000 fleeing refugees. And, of course, I got a book one time thinking it was going to be a great story. It was I forget the name of the book, but it was like the Wilhelm Gustloff, the real story. And, of course, they turned it into a Holocaust tale because like 500 Holocaust people who had decided to go with the Germans were on the Wilhelm Gustloff when it went down. And so, of course, it was all the Germans' fault. They never should have had them there, blah, 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 blah. Forget the 12,000 innocent Germans who were sunk here, the children who were crying out, freezing to death in the water. And so it was bad. And, of course, the British also strafed these and came in and shot them up. And it was just terrible. I remember one guy, one of the witness accounts says, I cannot forget the loud, clear sound of the siren as the Gustloff, with all her lights on, made her final plunge. I could clearly see the people still on board the Gustloff clinging to the rails. Even as she went under, they were still hanging on and screaming. All around us were people swimming or just floating in the sea. I can still see their hands grasping at the sides of our lifeboat. But it was too full to take on anymore. And so they just, like I said, this was, if you think the Titanic was something, Titanic was 1,517 dead. This is 10 Titanics. This is 12 Lusitanias. And nobody that you talk to, this is one of those things where almost nobody has ever heard of this, nor can they believe the absolute war crime. And of course, there was an investigation. And as I said, they ruled that it really wasn't a war crime because there was an office for the Waffen-SS or something on the boat. Absolutely pathetic. A hospital ship, clearly marked as well, from above, with red crosses and et cetera, et cetera.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money-controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
Mike Walsh. I love Mike because Mike loves to put a lot of art in his articles. And that's what magazines do. We sometimes get so dense it's hard to get through an issue, especially when it's 140 pages. But he talked about the Red ransacking of the Reich. Now, that's something we haven't talked about before, but we hadn't talked about what happened to the generals who got caught ransacking the Reich. And, of course, these generals, any number of them, lieutenant generals, colonel generals, major generals of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet soldiers themselves were just told to basically grab every single thing they probably get their hands on and then bring it back to the Soviet Union. You know, the Soviet Union, as you well know, picked up entire factories and moved them up piece by piece so they could relocate them in the Soviet Union. But they also took ungodly numbers of paintings from independent and wealthy collectors that they found in castles and stuff. I'm talking about Degas, Monet, and El Greco, ones that people will never see again. I think they took somewhere around, was it 30,000 paintings, of which something like, I could have that number wrong, 20,000 of them are still unaccounted for. But like a Soviet soldier might grab a Renoir, we'll say, and it might have a bathing nude, right? Well, that was like a piece of porno for a soldier, a Soviet soldier, and he pasted up on the outhouse they were on, right? You're talking putting nails through a Renoir. But anyway, that was minor compared to what these generals had done, including Zhukov, Georgy Zhukov, who was one of the worst generals in history, would have thrown. It was like General Ulysses S. Grant on steroids, right? He'd throw, it was like Cold Harbor times 20. But anyway, they took all gobs of stuff. They took stuff from the ancient eras out of the museums. They took gold pieces. They went through private collections, took silver and goldware, porcelain, plates, table settings, silks, rolls of embroidery, tapestries. And of course, Stalin thought, oh, that's great. And then he found out that all these Soviet generals were taking it back home and putting them in their own collections. Well, that kind of irritated him. He kind of knew there was some lower level, a small amount of personal pilfering going on. But these guys ended up having to be, by the way, these were called trophies of war. So they went to the trophy trials, and he put these guys on trial. He shot a few of them. Later, after Stalin died, though, a lot of them were in jail, and they were all resuscitated. I mean, the shocking thing was these were guys, generals, who would show up at peace treaties and big international meetings, between the Allies and the Soviets, how to divvy up the different lands and such, and all this. It would kind of be like you would find out that Mike Pence and Joe Biden, right, were getting ready to be shot because they had stolen so much stuff from museums in Europe. So it's a very interesting story. It talks about the different punishments, the different generals who were involved, how much they took, how much plunder they had, what they looked like, who got resuscitated and who didn't. And of course, then after that, it's a fascinating article. I thought that.
I noticed you even have pictures here of a couple of these generals' wives with the German.
That's Lydia Ruslanova. Well, she's been repeated picture, but she was like a famous poet, I believe, or a singer. No, she was a famous singer, and she was married to this greedy dude. Hold on a second, I'm going to grab a picture of him because it was hilarious. They got a picture of him, and he got this little toy horse. He was this big fat Soviet general, and they're both laughing, and he's sitting on his little hobby horse. He was Lieutenant General Kryakov. Her name was Lydia Ruslanova. She was she did get back out of prison. Once Stalin died, then Zhukov was resuscitated, and then Zhukov took care of all of his buddies. And so a lot of these guys got back out. But that is a hilarious picture of him. And if you look at her at home, behind her you can see the porcelain and the plateware and the vases and all this stuff. Now, she was, in the end, she went back and became a folk singer. She was famous for her Russian folk singing. Fascinating little article. As usual, Mike Walsh always hides some very interesting thing within these articles. Lots of pictures. You got to really read carefully, look at these pictures that he provides. And some of them are laughable in this particular issue if it wasn't such a horrible thing. But what happened to these greedy guys? I mean, did they not think there was going to be some punishment for them inevitably? And of course, we finish up with a review by Dr. Ed DeVries, of course, on one of the great books that we've ever sold. It's Hitler Democrat, written by General Leon Degrelle. And a very nice review of that particular book. And in there, you say it taught you more about Adolf Hitler's rise to power than any book you've ever read, correct?
Yes.
Great stuff. And I think people ought to all buy that book. Very, very good book. And it sold many good. And of course, Degrelle, we love Degrelle. Degrelle was a Waffen-SS soldier from Belgium, rose up as a nationalist politician, became a lower-level officer in the Waffen-SS, never involved in any atrocities, never involved in the prison camp activities. But at the end of the war, he was hunted down, made his way to Spain, crash landed there, nearly died, and lived his life out under Franco's Spain. And of course, he wrote his own book called My Revolutionary Life, which people have tried to translate, but no translation as good as this translation done by our guys here, John DeNugent and Margaret Huff-Stickler, which was just brilliant. And of course, the back of this particular issue is loaded with our book list. So I really think if people want to buy some books, they ought to buy this issue because you got this whole book list for the whole year. But people really ought to check out BarnesReview.com and sign up to get our little product blast. We mostly put out product blast, and that way they have this book list for the whole year, plus this massively beautiful 2-color issue, heavily illustrated. And one I think everybody's going to be very proud of. Willis Carto loved talking about World War II. He thought it was the most lied about war in history. This kind of is dedicated to him and to Harry Elmer Barnes because this is our 25th anniversary edition. We actually started in 94. So this will be our 26th year of publishing. But we had 94 and 95 were combined into one volume. So this is volume 25.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org, and help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. Well, do you want to hear a dangerous thought, Paul? If Willis Carto was wrong, and World War II is not the most lied about war in history. In other words, let's say that all of the wars of antiquity were lied about as much or more. Do you realize our whole perception of history, therefore, is that far off?
Well, looking at what's happening in the world today, I can honestly say that much of the news goes down as an historical record, and it's all false. It's so much falsehood. Falsehood in wartime. The truth is the first victim of war. The victors write the histories. Over and over again, people have warned of this, and I don't think he was wrong, of course. And he had his own opinions about a lot of things. He died in 2015. The one thing he wanted And one thing he respected above most of all was freedom of speech. He really didn't care if your opinion was different from his. He'd argue with you. And his enemies, his friends, whoever, he liked a good debate. The one thing he was interested in was, and never scared of, was talking about the most sensitive subjects out there. Cost him dearly, of course. But the Barnes Review was founded by Willis in 1994. I was there in 1994, and I say in my editorial that lots changed in 25 years. We thought it was hard enough to talk about such things as the war guilt and the Holocaust and the Federal Reserve, right, and the Israeli lobby and other powerful foreign lobbies, corruption in U.S. politics, stealing of elections, all this stuff. The Bilderberg Group is a perfect example that Willis was onto that well early, and he was called a lunatic, right, for years and years and years. And what did it turn out? That finally, he couldn't hide it anymore. After we were the only outlets covering the Bilderberg Group it started in 55, I believe. I can't remember there, but I think we may have started talking about it in 75. We started showing up, and he went to one in Turkey, and then he had Jim Tucker, a reporter, go there, and Jim Tucker was a lunatic, they said, too. And, of course, we were the only reporter there covering Bilderberg meetings from, 1983 to 2005. All of a sudden, then the world caught on. And we weren't lunatics. Well, no, they didn't mention us. Sorry. Nobody even mentions the fact that Willis was really the one who uncovered the Bilderberg Group, this crazy lunatic, allegedly. And now every news organization in the world talks about it. They never mentioned Willis. Never mentioned Jim Tucker. Never mentioned the Spotlight. Never mentioned American Free Press. So we're out of the historical record there, even though we're the ones who expose us. And one day I'm hoping maybe everybody will be talking about the topics that are in the Barnes Review as freely as they talk about the Bilderberg Group. I doubt it, because these are very politically incorrect topics. But at the very least, I can just tell you from past experience that Cardo wasn't wrong about too much. And if he was, he'd admit it. And he'd inspire other people to investigate themselves. And he also had great resistance from some of the biggest lobbying outfits and organizations in the world. So he must have been on the right track. But judge for yourself by getting this September-October Werewolf of the Reich, the German underground resistance movement, and other World War II tales, we'll say. And tell me if you can find one error of fact in that whole issue.
Well, Willis had started other magazines, but the Barnes Review was the one that endured. And so why was that?
That's me, of course. No, I'm just kidding. Because I think it was one that covered so many subjects. The Institute of Historical Review, which still is around, is and still focuses a little bit more broadly, but was focused on the Holocaust. Look, I mean, after publishing 25 books on the Holocaust, selling 50 books on the Holocaust, those guys have proven their point. There's not much else to say. They've been vilified for it, locked up, put down. But after a while, I must say that single topic magazines will bore people inevitably, especially once they've proven their point. But the Barnes Review will talk about anything. This particular issue is the theme issue. We talk about, as you well know, the war between the states, the French Revolution, ancient man, ancient monuments like Göbekli Tepe and the Mongolian Aryans. We talk about modern politics. We talk about what people might consider conspiracy theories and whatever new information comes up on, say, the assassination of John F. Kennedy or even. And so I think it's diversity is what has made it last, really. And we do it on a shoestring budget for the most part, but it comes out and it's very good looking. And it's we'll cover just about anything I'm thinking we've had. And we also tackle the most politically incorrect topics out there. I must say, though, that our readers are getting older and younger people aren't reading like they used to. This magazine will, too, have to change with the times sooner or later. It does have that electronic version that's only $36 a year for 6 big fat issues. And it's much cheaper than, say, spending $90 to get it in Europe. It's tough to mail nowadays with the expense of everything. As far as that goes,
well, not only that, but apparently a lot of these issues are being confiscated when we try to mail them into Europe and Canada.
Well, Canada specifically seems to have a problem. They must know us better, but books Any single issues we're not having a big problem with, as much as we are orders where people might order 10. When the minute something gets over a certain weight and it has the Barnes Review on it, it's being confiscated at the Canadian border. Not every single order, but ones maybe going to someone whose name is on a list or was involved in a lot of German names. Maybe they were involved in the German-American one back in the day or whatever. Mexico, we don't seem to have much problem with. Russia and China, they deliver the mail. They don't care, right? But European nations are a little bit more strict. And if that magazine, the envelope happens to quote unquote pop open, it's trouble, because what we discuss here is illegal in foreign countries, which is why a good way to get this is via the emailing it to you or downloading it from our website. I mean, you can get these PDFs for $5 a pop or something, and you can print them out at home or read them in crystal clarity on your computer or larger tablet. Being a PDF, it's a little harder to read on your phone because you're constantly scrolling through the pages. But it's the diversity of the content. We talked about the Illuminati in the cover issue of one of these. We've talked about Jewish issues, which irritates the ADL to no end. We sell a wide variety of books on European history, revisionist history as far as Soviet Union. We sell our Story of the Nation series, which is books written somewhere usually between 1890 and 1950 before political correctness took over, on Ireland and Russia and Austria and South Africa. We've talked about the debacle in South Africa, but we do basically discuss history from a white point of view because nobody else does. And I certainly wouldn't call what we put in here supremacist by any means, because we're as hard on our own people as we are on anybody else, our own grand failures and our own great successes. But we will also support any nationalist movements of anyone within the United States or in foreign countries who like to see black nationalists and even Jewish groups and American Indians, whoever it may be, that are willing to move forward with the truth and to build pride in their own people without foisting lies on them. There's no need to lie to your people necessarily to instill pride in them, although we do we understand greatly about myth and the importance of myth and teaching the myths of our own cultures to our children and such, and we're well-rounded educationally. We used to teach that and learn that in school when I was a kid. I'm not sure they're teaching that anymore. Remember, we'd always learned about the great Nordic myths and the Greek and Roman myths, and we'd even talk about the great African tales, American Indian tales and such. And these are important things. But generally speaking, what you're going to find in the Barnes Review is just facts, eyewitness accounts of things that they don't want us talking about. They just don't want. And he always thought that the Holocaust has always gotten us in trouble because we're willing to talk about the Holocaust from a scientific point of view. But that I always thought to myself, well, that's what's getting in trouble, because that's the books they ban. That's the reason they give us for really taking away the PayPal and the Kindle account and the Amazon account and the credit cards and all that stuff. But nowadays, you know as well as I do that we couldn't write an article that was, say, laudatory of Robert E. Lee without being called a white supremacist. We couldn't talk about Juniper Serra, Father Juniper Serra, right, without being called white supremacist. He was just a Catholic priest who ministered to the Indians. We couldn't probably even talk about Lewis and Clark, right, along the way. Couldn't have done it without Sacagawea, right, And we can't talk about anything unless we condemn our historical point of view and launch the fake narrative. So you want a little bit of truth, or at least what we think is the truth, according to what we've found out in history, then, check out the Barnes Review and tell me what you think about it, because we're also willing to talk to you and communicate with you. I don't write too many letters these days. It's mostly emails and telephone calls because I haven't got time anymore. But we will talk to you about it. And I have calls from all kinds of people. And we've had some very good, over the years, people praise the magazine. And, of course, they've been vilified for it and attacked and shamed, right, in this new cancel culture thing where you'll get docs, John Toland and Mark Lane and Michael Collins Piper, famous author, Victor Thorne, who used to write for us before their deaths, and Fletcher Prouty, who got to know Willis quite well and had some very interesting tales to tell CIA activity. And of course, say, get us in the same problem Trump's got in trouble with. You don't challenge the news media. You don't challenge the intelligence services in this country, or you're going to be in trouble. We don't have time to go into it. Perhaps we will in another interview. But looking at the 326 pages of FOIA documents that someone sent us that they got on Willis, it was just very interesting what they were interested in, how interested they were in him and his activities, and how they really don't like anybody challenging the historical and really the historical narrative. They want that lock on history. And the other reason is we've been successful is that people appreciate that there's no money in this business. You know what I mean? People that write for us, who write an article of 5,000 or 6,000 words, get paid a couple $100 for an article, and they probably spend $400 on the books that they get. So it's a money-losing proposition. You know that they're in it for the right reason, and you also know that on our editorial contributing editors board that a number of them, 25%, 20%, have been locked up in prison for talking about historical topics that are no longer legal to talk about in 14 to 17 European countries, Australia, New Zealand, and then I'm trying to think, and Canada. Hey man, it looks like one day we're all going to be turning to Russia and China to get credit card processing and to get the truth out. And if that isn't a hoot to think that we'd have to go to China for free speech nowadays, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. That's how much the world has changed.
Well, I've been joking with my wife that maybe we need to learn Russian.
Listen, the Russians have always appreciated several things. Even during the Soviet era, they couldn't crush that Christianity in the Soviet Union, despite the fact killing 60 million of them. There's a spirit of truth there. There's a cultural pride that they have that they haven't been able to crush. I don't know, though. I really don't know, because when the minute I praise Putin, then I do have readers who go, don't you know he never would have gotten where he is if he wasn't part of the problem, and he's got a rabbi like in a kosher kitchen in the Kremlin and all this stuff. I don't know. But I do know that it's certainly better than it is now. At least Putin isn't scared to say what's on his mind, which is why they appreciate Trump to some degree. Trump, too, has been told there are certain things he cannot talk about. But yeah, I think that it's a magazine. This is definitely a magazine that you will enjoy and that should be able to last into the future as long as it's not made illegal, what we talk about. Because we do not advocate violence in any way. We do have a picture of the wrong picture or the wrong topic might get it banned in a prison here. I have a lot of prisoners, maybe 2-3% of my readers, and they have a hard time getting the magazine because we have pictures of swastikas when we talk about the Third Reich. You know what I mean? We've got pictures of say, a Greek statue, which they might ban it because it's nudity or something crazy. So they don't want these people to have their own thoughts in prison. And we're all in our own little prison, aren't we now? As far as being able to be hemmed in and branded and locked away from the good portions of society, But anyway, that's the importance of the few remaining organizations that have been able to survive in this era. So things are changing, and we'll figure out a way to survive into the future. But we do need more younger people reading these magazines, and we do need more younger people willing to read and not just post videos. They love videos nowadays, but these videos can be banned. This is why I don't like the internet. They can be banned. They can be gotten rid of. They can be wiped out with the push of a button. Whereas print publications still will be around on your bookshelves till the day they come to the house to confiscate them. So it's important.
Well, I appreciate you chatting with me today, Paul. And I definitely, thought that this was probably one of the best issues of the Barnes Review that I've ever seen. And I've probably seen all of the last about 10 years worth.
Well, good. I'm glad you liked it.
And we are out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, so I am going to cut the interview there. But we did accomplish the mission. Paul and I did make it through the entirety of the TBR 25th anniversary issue. And it was definitely a great issue. As I said earlier in the broadcast, maybe one of the greatest issues of TBR that we have ever produced. So I hope that you'll go to the website, www.barnesreview.org,
and you'll find out how to get you a copy of this great issue. Or better yet, just subscribe to the Barnes Review, and 6 times a year you'll get this great magazine in the mail, and we'll also get a PDF edition by email, and you won't have to think about it anymore. Also, go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net, and when you're there, you can sign up for a free copy of my weekly email newsletter, the Dixie Heritage Letter, and along with it will come absolutely free of charge a copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And so once again, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents, God bless. See you next week. Same time, same place.